But let's start sharing an overview of your career trajectory and maybe a couple of points of wisdom that you would share with someone who's in the process of the job search in the nonprofit industry right now. Let's start off with Tara.
So I would say, like some others, I have a very broad history. I worked in local government, worked in nonprofit, but I've also worked in higher education. None of which I thought I was going to do when I graduated from the Humphrey. I thought I was going to go and, work for the city and be a planner, and actually landed a job working with Hennepin County in what was then called Office of Strategic Initiatives, where we worked on a wide variety of projects. One thing I would say that is very important during your time, either in school or post school, is to create a toolkit. So it's a basket of pretty much goods and services that you can provide based on your skills, whether it's program evaluation, statistics, focused conversations, strategic planning, things of that nature that you can hone through volunteer work more often than not, or through projects if you're still in school. Those are really the skills that will help you get a job, but also keep a job. There's also other ways to learn those when you're volunteering, because again, the stakes sometimes are not as high as they are on a job, but again, there's more time to learn. So for me, that's where I got a lot of my experience. I served as a board chair for multiple years for several NRP, Minneapolis neighborhood organizations. I also worked with the city as a volunteer and served on various boards and commissions there, as well as with the state Democratic Party, worked on several boards and commissions there, holding leadership offices and things of that nature. So I was able to take my skills from the classroom, but also learn new skills in my volunteer work. So that's what I would just leave, just a little bit of advice for those of you who are looking to either do a switch or are currently starting out, is what kind of volunteer work are you doing? What does your toolkit look like? And does that toolkit allow you to address all the needs that you would like? What do you like to do, and what are you good at?
Fantastic. Rachel, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I would echo what Tara said. Toolkits have been really important to me, and I think that ties to my piece of wisdom as well, and that would be prepared and willing to learn on the job. So in my career trajectory, there were a few ups and downs. So when I left the Humphrey School, I really hoped to work in the field of international affairs, which is really, really competitive. And where I landed was a little bit different. Rather than working in government, I ended up in the nonprofit sector. The nature of my work in my first nonprofit job was still international, but it was outside of any of the skills that I had learned as a policy student. And so I just absorbed everything that I could in that first job where I was doing international fundraising. It was rough. There was a very steep learning curve, but in about a year, I felt like I had the equivalent of a 4-year degree in nonprofit fundraising, just from learning on the job and being willing to take projects that were outside my comfort zone. And that's what really helped me build a very effective toolkit in nonprofit fundraising. With that skill set, I was able to really have my choice of nonprofit jobs, whether I wanted to continue working in an issue area that was important to me or not, because nonprofits rely on fundraising. So I would just say after you graduate, you're still going to be learning. Really embrace what you can learn on the job and through volunteer work. And don't be afraid to, get your feet wet in skill areas that you don't know a whole lot about. It will really pay off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. And just a brief reminder to our panelists, sometimes nonprofit can be alphabet soup. So we want to make sure that everything that we provide is really approachable. So if you use a quick abbreviation, let's just set it up beforehand so everybody knows. We make sure we're on the same page. Jeff, what do you have? What are the overview of your career trajectory and maybe a couple points of wisdom you could share?
Sure. I obviously agree with everything that's been said already. And the big thing I believe in it is that flexibility and really following your passion. I started with an undergraduate degree in business, but I knew the arts was always my passion. And so one day at Northrop, after seeing a performance as an undergrad, I saw an advertisement for an internship, called, and ended up leaving early to graduate and starting a career at Jacobsville Dance Festival out in Massachusetts. And then that created sort of this chain of events, rather unexpected events. I have to sort of agree with Rachel that fundraising is probably the hardest part of any not-for-profit side of the job, and something you really have to learn how to do, even though you may feel uncomfortable thinking you're asking for money. But generally, it's something that people want to support when they're passionate about. So it's something that you do on. I really believe in finding people that you admire to work with. I've been very lucky to work with sort of people that have spent time with me, spent time willing to educate me and answer my questions and put up with my silly questions, but mentor me in a bit. There's never a formal mentorship, but I think that's very important. And even when I had an undergraduate business degree, I've always sort of on that side of managing the organization, but I realized, especially in talking to the boards and a lot of those people that were supporting it, I needed to speak their language. So after a 2-year sort of disaster run where I took a job working for a Broadway producer and we lost a lot of money very quickly, I realized it was time for me to cycle back into the nonprofit space, but I wanted to be educated to do that. So I went back and got an MBA, and I think most of the people here have advanced degrees, and I can't recommend that enough, because I think that is a really great thing to be that sort of well-rounded in that education space. But I've jumped into multiple industries, and I think that that flexibility is really been helpful and not scared of a crisis. People in not-for-profits tend to be the most flexible people I know. They jump in and solve problems and are willing to sort of work hard to fix things, though sometimes that can be taken for granted a bit. But I think about your ability to be flexible and open to change as you're thinking about a career not-for-profit. It's actually the best part of the job, but it may be the hardest part of the job.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Angelica.
Yeah, well, a little bit on my trajectory. So I'm a first generation American, I guess. My parents were immigrants. And I think for a lot of first gen folks, there's this need to support your community through systems navigation, through translation, through understanding cultural gaps and barriers. And so I grew up with that spirit of service, that sense of what I can do for myself, I can do for others. And so it's just always kind of guided the career decisions that I ended up making down the line. Like I said, I've always volunteered in one place or another. And I got my first job when I was 11, actually. But I always looked for that service angle in any job that I did. So for instance, when my husband was in the military and we moved to North Carolina, I took a job at a horticultural nursery doing shipping logistics and HR trainings, right? Completely unrelated to anything that I was remotely interested in. But the workers there were migrant workers who had never seen a Latina in the office. And so they would come to me and talk to me about problems that they were having, just general personnel issues or problems with their boss or issues of sexual harassment. And I knew what these things were. And so I was able to create a training for all of the migrant workers on OSHA safety practices and what their rights were in the workplace. And I did it in Spanish and in English. So just looking for those ways to serve and support folks who, just need that extra bridge in order to do better and feel better and be more included and welcome in their workplaces. From there, we went on a tour overseas. And as I mentioned, I manage a thrift shop. Again, like who wants to manage a thrift shop, right? But for me, the draw was all of our profits were going to military dependents. And so that drive to say, how do I learn marketing? How do I learn merchandising? How do I redesign the layout of this store? How do I learn from best practices from places like Urban Outfitters that rotate their floor space to keep people interested in coming back? So really just kind of teaching myself as I went, and then picking up credits at random colleges and community colleges, four-year colleges on that military wife journey. So it took me 11 years to finish my BA over five colleges and universities as I continued to serve at all of these different places that we went. So when I came to Minnesota in 2011, after finishing my BA finally, I mean, that was a big deal in my family. I was the first one to graduate from college, first one to graduate from high school. And it took that long. It was really blood, sweat, and tears for me. So one of my passion projects is all around youth leadership and youth development, because there's a lot of young folks who are in the same boat. And so that's something that really drives me as well. So when I came to Minnesota with my BA in psychology, of course, you need to go to grad school because a BA in psychology doesn't get you a whole lot. But I took a job at Anderson United School in Minneapolis. And again, most of the students there were first-gen Latino students like me. And so I worked with special education students, did all of their testing in Spanish, implemented their individual learning programs. And I found it really gratifying to watch students progress year over year. But it felt too direct service for me. I wanted to do something more systemic. And that's how I ended up at the Humphrey School. So I did my MPP there. And while I was there, I interned at the Wilder Foundation. And that was a good place for me to see what the internal functions of a nonprofit actually look like, as opposed to kind of plugging in and going. This was more structural and institutional experience for me: project creation, project implementation, project evaluation, all in real time. And working with very charged groups of stakeholders that all have an interest that's very competing, right? So that was a really good experience for me there as well. And then when I finished at Humphrey, I went to work in government. I thought government was going to be well paid. And so at that point, I was able to get experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors after, like I said, about 15 years of moving around. And what I learned in the government space is exactly what Rachel was talking about, is that public policy when it comes to economic development is very engineer heavy. And there's a lot of things that I do, but one of the things I don't do is science. I don't science. And so learning again that there's, dozens of different types of grass seed, and what's a bollard, and how do you manage the construction and demolition of a building? These were things that were way outside of my wheelhouse. But again, just kind of learning as much as I could over the 3 years that I was at the city of Brooklyn Park. I'm still feeling like I'm providing service to a community that isn't reflected in its own leadership. So being able to support that and innovate there and infuse the equity principles into processes that had never been reconsidered was also a powerful part of my growth. And then transitioning back into the nonprofit sector to go work at the Citizens League as policy director there, I was able to lead the process at the city of St. Paul when they were deciding on what their new minimum wage was going to be. So at that point, I had about 4 or 5 years of facilitation experience. I was able to gather folks who could have these competing interests and come to a common ground solution, which was about 90% implemented by the city of St. Paul. And then from there into Clues in 2019. And I guess that kind of ties into my words of wisdom for you is I moved into Clues despite loving my work at the Citizens League, because my community was under a different kind of pressure under the Trump administration. And so sitting out on the sidelines and thinking about policy without getting a chance to implement and get my hands dirty and get involved was just too hard for me. So moving into into Clues and creating a new department around advocacy, leadership, community empowerment, that kind of stuff it was very healing for me. It's part of how I survived the last 2.5 years. And so now I'm transitioning out of Clues and thinking about what I want to do next. So this is interesting timing, this transitions panel, because I started my own LLC back in October and have been doing side projects in facilitation and stakeholder engagement for the last 7 or 8 months. And right now I'm serving a short-term project with the governor's office around redesign of the current hate crimes reporting process. So I'm giving a lot of thought to whether I want to grow out my business and dedicate myself to more community projects in different organizations, or whether I want to look for a new big position at another foundation or nonprofit, which I think a lot of you are thinking about as well. So my advice, if you haven't been in the nonprofit space before, is know the tempo. Know that the nonprofit field is different from the private sector. It's different from the public sector. I have found that the public sector and the private sector tend to be a little bit more structured. They're 9 to 5, right? No one wants to pay overtime. No one wants to be there after 5 on a Friday, right? Like that to me has been mostly the tempo of the public and private spaces, but the nonprofit space is not like that. The nonprofit space is kind of 24/7 cycles. It's you have to be nimble, you have to be ready, you have to switch topic focuses depending on what's happening in community and where the need has shifted. It's all, it's both proactive and reactive, so it's more dimensional. I feel like in the private sector and in the public sector, your job is kind of clearly defined. It's pretty linear. You do this, you are a specialist at this. Where in the nonprofit sector, it's really an all hands on deck effort almost all the time. And you're gonna have to push yourself to do some of the stuff that you may never have done. You might find yourself planning a gala. You might find yourself learning how to create a brochure. So just know that that's the tempo of the nonprofit space. It's really more of a personal commitment, more of a round the clock dedication. And it almost starts to blur the line between the professional and the personal space.
Thank you, Angelica. All right, let's move into a couple other questions. So we'll have just 2 of our panelists answer these next 2 questions. So let's start. This first one will be for Rachel and Angelica. Many people can get overwhelmed by all of the different career options that fall under this large nonprofit umbrella. Are there strategies you'd recommend for someone who's trying to find an area that might be a really good fit for them? Rachel, let's start with you.
Thank you, Brittany. This is a great question. Yeah, the nonprofit sector is so diverse. It ranges from everything from finance and IT to executive leadership to direct service. So sometimes I imagine the nonprofit sector as everything that exists in the private sector or the public sector, except the purpose of your work is really social good. It isn't profit, it isn't power. It's making change. And so one of the best ways that I've found to learn about those different career tracks is through volunteerism. When I was a student in college, I did a number of unpaid internships, which now I regret. I wish they would have been paid, but in a variety of different nonprofit roles. And that allowed me to build up a really solid knowledge base of what kind of roles existed out there. And it allowed me to be able to find affinity with the roles that suited my skills and my goals and my personality best. I would also say, if you're just starting out in your career, don't be afraid to change jobs. If you're working in a nonprofit position, for a year and it isn't really resonating with you, don't be afraid to move on. Even though it is really tough to leave a job and change, it can be really valuable for your professional growth in the long run.
Thank you, Rachel. Angelica?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways I think to examine for fit. I think Rachel's spot on. Volunteering is one of the best ways to just kind of get your feet wet and see if you really like it. For me, there's 2 things that are guiding my search right now. And there's lots of great opportunities out there right now. I follow the Pollen job board. If you're not familiar with these, Pollen, the Council on Nonprofits. I go back and look at some of the government websites as I really give deep thought to what I want to do next. The Minnesota Council on Foundations has a great job board. And what I look for as I'm evaluating each one of these potential opportunities is 2 things. One is this an issue that I want to go to bat for? Is this something that I want to campaign hard for? Can I really dedicate myself to this in a way that is holistic and authentic? Because if you've heard people say here, a big part of the job is going to be fundraising. And sometimes it's like straight fundraising for actual money, but sometimes it's also about partnership development and in-kind donations and that kind of cultivation. So is this an issue that I feel passionate enough about that I can go out and be a strong advocate for it? Somebody sent me this incredible position that I was perfectly qualified for that deals with environmental issues. And again, it was like, oh no, again, I don't science. I can math with you all day, but I cannot science. And so I'm not going to be effective as an advocate in that role. And it's not something that I'm going to be able to really commit to and think about on my off time and get excited about. The other way to look at it is also organizationally. Is there an organization that, again, like you would go to bat for? Would you wear that t-shirt when you're out at the farmer's market and promote that you work there, right? So that's another thing that I do is there's maybe 4 or 5 organizations that I can get really excited about. I take a look at their job boards every now and again and think, is that a place where I want to commit myself to? A whole nother thing is something that I mentioned already about what prompted my move to Clues, which was timing. It was what is happening in my community, what is happening out in communities. Is that something I want to get involved in? Is that something that will excite me? And then, I saw on the registration sheet that most of you are mid-career professionals, but know that going back on those informational interviews is not out of the question, right? Like you can still do that, like you probably did when you first came out of grad school. You can still do it again as a mid-career professional. Just getting to know people and creating those relationships is a really important part of the nonprofit sector anyway. So I frequently get emails from folks that I've never met who say, I want to talk to you about the kind of work we're doing here, or I saw what you were doing at Clues. I'd like to talk more about that, or whatever it is. And so building those relationships and creating that network, I think, is another good way to do it. But at the end of the day, what drove me when I was even thinking about what I wanted to study in grad school was sitting back and saying, okay, if I had Oprah money, or when I talk to young people, I say, if I had Kylie Jenner money, right? And I didn't have to work for the money, which, we all do. But assuming that I didn't, what would I do with all my time, right? Once you're done with all the traveling and the shopping and all of that stuff and spending time at the beach, what would you do with your time if you didn't have to worry about money again? And for me, it's always about community.
Thanks, Angelica. And if you haven't seen, Marcy dropped the paulinmidwest.org job board in the chat. It's a great resource for everyone. Okay, next question for Jeff and Tara. Are there specific professional development opportunities or other avenues for connecting with your peers that you would recommend to this group or to people who are new to the industry? Let's start with Jeff.
Sure. Some of it's what was said before as well. I think the internships, I started on the internship path at 2 in a row. I remember way back then, my first internship paid me $50 a month plus room and board. So that was quite an experience on trying to survive like that. But what I found really engaging about the not-for-profit space is that there generally is a large community around it. So there's a community of unofficial and official associations around typically the topic that you're focusing on, be it education or the environment. So there's lots of opportunities to interact with those leaders. So to think about those or so follow those, listen to see what they're doing, and find people in the industry that you want to pay attention to. I was lucky enough to I fell into the education space when I needed to move back to Minnesota. And the academic world, one thing the academic world has a lot of is associations that you work with. And so I joined a board of that, which was extremely helpful with that as well. And for now example, I'm board chair of Northrop right now. So I think that having those activities are really important for you to do that as well. We're living in the world of a lot of sort of alternative credentials as well. So a lot of these associations provide a lot of learning opportunities that you can think about. They can be short-term, they can be long-term. I'm in the business education space, and we laugh that most of the content now is free. So even if you need to learn more about finance or accounting or marketing, a lot of that's there. A lot of it's there for you to do free online or through other associations to do that as well. And I just, there's sort of professional and there's personal self-care as well. Angelica talked about the 24/7 nature of the nonprofit world, and you do it because you're passionate about it. I worked in the theater, so basically you got in the office at 9, you worked until 5 or 6, grabbed a sandwich, and then you were in the theater till 11, and you did that 6 to 7 days a week. And at a certain point, you just can't do that anymore. So you got to figure out what that balance is and what sort of outside things you can do to sort of maintain your your mental and physical health, because it's really important to do that. So I think you got to think of sort of professional development, and then, you know, passion can lead to 24/7 commitment, but you can only do that for so long. So that's part of the growth of being a leader in a nonprofit space, is knowing that, no, tonight I'm leaving at 5, and you can call me if there's an emergency, but please, I think you can manage on your own, and that's how you learn how to develop leaders of your organization for the future. Thanks.
Great. Tara, what are your thoughts on this?
Lots and lots of thoughts. Mostly just because I've just been in so many different positions, as a staff person, again, as an executive director, as a volunteer, as a board chair who's had to stand in the gap when I've had to get rid of an executive director and still lead the organization. There's so much that I learned about my nonprofit work through my volunteer work. I'm going to keep saying volunteer, because that's really where you get to kind of suss out what kind of work you want to do, whether it's fundraising, or do you want to work for a corporate nonprofit? That's the other thing I think that we haven't talked about today, is that there's different sectors of nonprofit. There's the corporate side, which is a little more like, you know, maybe like a American Red Cross or Bone Marrow Foundation or United Way. And then there's your more community-based organizations like a Wilder Foundation or your neighborhood association. They're different structures, have different numbers of people and different accountability, but the skills are still the same. But as Angelica talked about earlier, the climates are different. You know, so you want to make sure that when you're on your search, what kind of climate are you looking for? I would say that was probably the biggest thing after a not great experience working for a local government. That was really a concern of mine when I went to a new job was, do you guys like each other? You know, because I'm with you more often than I am going to be with my family. So what's the environment? What am I going to add to this space? And so that also leads you to think about, well, do you want to be a more service type provider in nonprofits, which could be maybe a clinical health type organization, or do you want to give the money? I realized through my trajectory, which was somewhat similar to Angelica's, in that I wanted to be in the room where the decisions were made, both at a policy level, but then also at a money level. Just recently, I would say probably within the last 5 years, I've decided that I wanted to work for a foundation, because I wanted to be the person that not only created the programs or designed the money dissemination tools, but I also wanted to be the person in the room to be able to tell those with the money where to give it. Because for me, that was about being impactful in my community, but then also realizing that as a woman of color, as a Black woman, we're organizations that we run are often underfunded, and they struggle. Now, I got a lot of money because people knew who I was politically. So I knew where the bodies were buried, and I was able to go in and actually knock on the doors and demand, give me this money out of this pot because I know you have it. But everybody doesn't have that same level of access. And so I wanted to provide that. Ways that I used when I was in Minnesota to kind of help figure out my trajectory. We've talked about pollen. I was around with when Lars Leafblad actually created pollen. We were at the Humphrey together at that time, and it's, you know, currently exploding to its own organization. But it was a grassroots effort that really was about connecting people and nonprofits and their stories, as well as job search, professional organizations for the area that you're interested in, whether it's foundations, evaluation, program evaluation, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, we've talked about them. The African American Leadership Forum is also another local nonprofit organization that is focused on providing services, well, not services, but connecting professionals who want to provide services to the African American community in Minnesota. You don't have to be Black to utilize them, but the topics they do tend to work with more often are systematic issues related to the Black community. But it's a really great opportunity, I think, to network with those individuals that you may not always have a real connection with. The Citizens League, I think, is also another great place to start. Certificates and trainings, again, volunteer credentials toolkit. I'm a big fan of certificates, whether they are free online, you got to pay for them out of your own pocket, you get your employer to pay for them, whatever, get the credential. And the reason why is that it gives you a snapshot into the field that you want to go into, whether it's fundraising, program evaluation, strategic planning, leading facilitated conversations. What it allows you is to give you a very quick and defined set of tools and ways of being in order to get answers. And so those are skills that you can market, whether you're a volunteer or looking for employment. And then social media. I would say probably out here in the Bay Area, sort of the birthplace of social media, if you will, LinkedIn and Facebook have been my best friends with having to, one, network, but also have support groups or to hone the knowledge that I already have. Like this morning, I'm rolling out of bed, scrolling to Facebook, and someone's asking a question about inputs and outcomes. And I was like, had the wrong idea, and somebody gave some bad advice. So then what I do, I pull out my Humphrey degree, dust it off, and provide them with resources on what this person really needed to be looking at. It's like, what exactly are you trying to do? And what's your outcome? What exactly are you looking to do? It's that basic question. So those but those groups have been very helpful to me. LinkedIn has also been a great place for me to look for positions. I would say when I left higher ed in 2019, which is what brought me out to the Bay Area, and I started looking for work and really kind of did some soul searching and realized I really just wanted to be back in the nonprofit sector. LinkedIn, beefing up my profile on LinkedIn, as well as Indeed, out here were just two really great sources for me. Even after I landed a position later in the fall of 2020, I was still in an interview session for jobs that I was like, I am so not qualified for this position. But again, it was more of a look-see, we'll come back to you when you're ready. And I'm currently in two interview processes right now for two large foundations, executive directors for their foundations right now. And I'm in a position to be able to market myself very well for that, having had the opportunity to be here, to learn some skills, but also to really put what I've learned in my networks into place. So the questions they're asking me now is, how do you get connected? We know you're new. We know you can do the job. We know you can fundraise. How are you going to get connected? And so those are the ways that I've been talking in my interviews about how I will get connected using social media, connecting with sororities and fraternities, connecting with other social justice groups, or even just social groups. Out here, you believe it or not, the Lions Club and the Rotary are really, really big. I was like, this is a big city. It's the Bay Area, but there's smaller cities that really act like smaller suburban cities, even though, they got 300,000 people. So some of the traditional organizations that we have kind of poo-pooed on because we live in Minneapolis and it's a big city, other parts of the country still utilize those structures, like the that's League of Women Voters, which is also, I think, another great place to start looking and making connections. It's the something Justice League for women. And what's interesting about that is that their platform is, while it's about volunteering, it's about making connections. So some of these non-traditional organizations that we've kind of just brushed off in Minneapolis as either old or not really worthwhile, in other parts of the country are thriving and are really at the core of their nonprofit social justice community engagement work. So I would suggest that as you move forward, looking for your search, whether it's in Minneapolis or someplace else, to expand your horizon and don't limit yourself on where you look or who you connect with, because you might be surprised where you find some traction.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to move us into Q&A really quickly here. We'll take a couple of questions, maybe 1 to 2, depending on how our responses go. And then I want to get us out into breakout rooms so you have an opportunity to actually connect more personally with everyone else here and with our panelists. So the first question I have for Q&A, and I'll ask our panelists like 30-second response. We're going to keep it really short and sweet, top of mind. If you don't have anything, feel free and we'll jump on. This is a question from Eric. He said, I volunteered at local, regional, and national levels for nonprofits. how would you recommend I transition into a paid position in the nonprofit world? So I have all this volunteer experience. Let's say he's identified what he wants to do. He's got that honed in. Now, what's that transition into actually working in the space from volunteerism? Go for it, Tara.
So as someone who actually had to do that, I would say the biggest piece is going to be how you structure your resume. Your volunteer work should look like paid work, period. They should have to question whether or not you were paid. The skills that you've learned should show up in your skill set piece at the top of your resume, and really make it look professional. My LinkedIn resume is a bit of that because, LinkedIn kind of limits what you can do. But I'd be more than happy to share with you my resume, and sort of my earliest version and the version I currently have right now, which I've helped with others, whether they be graduate students or just friends and family, because your resume is your first space where people are going to get to know you, and how you clump the experience, particularly when you're older. And I say older because over 40 now is old, in some spaces, particularly in nonprofit. How you structure your information is going to be very important. But making sure that you really delve into the story of your volunteer work first, pulling out those skills, those projects, those learnings, those leadership spaces that you've led, and making sure that those show up on your resume. So it'll also help if you put it up on LinkedIn and you're looking for, and their algorithm is looking for jobs for you. The same thing works with Indeed. But then it also help you hone in on what exactly are the jobs that you're looking for, and what are the words that are going to trigger the searches that you want. So we're more than happy to talk about that later, but just want to pop in with that.
Awesome. Angelica.
Yeah, I think it's extremely common. It's been my experience in the nonprofit sector for people to transition in from other sectors. It's not as big of a jump as you would think. I've heard it's really hard to transition into the federal government sector, for instance, but nonprofit, people come in from everywhere all the time, and they come with extremely desirable experience. So I would say also, Eric, like, what have you done in your professional job? I guarantee it's going to be transferable into the nonprofit sector. A lot of the jobs that I have seen open or that I have found are hard to fill from the nonprofits I've worked at are in accounting, in HR, in communications, grant writers. Every nonprofit needs grant writers. There is, gosh, I can't even tell you how hard it is to find people who want to be grant writers and who are good at it and strong writers. So I think that's one thing is to consider that your work is going to be completely transferable. And if you've been a VP somewhere else, you're ready to come in and lead a nonprofit anyway. And they're all different sizes and different structures. Is it a smaller nonprofit that you want to run? Is it a bigger nonprofit that you want to transition in senior leadership? So know that whatever you've done is transferable and buildable.
Fantastic. And if you haven't noticed, and Rachel, I will come to you to have you answer this. And I'm going to tie in for Rachel and Jeff 2 questions, and then we'll move into the breakout room section. But there's a ton of resources in the chat of people who are providing job boards and other places where you can kind of help narrow down some of those conversations. So Rachel, let's touch on transitioning. And then also there's a question of how important is it having a BA? What do we think of the importance of education in that space as well?
Sorry, I did the mute thing. So on the topic of transitions, Eric, I would say if you haven't already, use your connections and make more connections. The nonprofit sector, in my experience, is very, very people-driven. So even if your skill set isn't perfectly aligned to a nonprofit job that you want, if you have great connections that can give you a reference or introduce you to someone there, that's also really helpful. In addition to everything that Tara and Angelica said. So for Holly's question about the importance of having a BA, I would say right now it depends. I've been seeing a lot of pushback from folks in the nonprofit sector against kind of formal credentialing, especially in community-led organizations. I've been noticing that there is a push to recognize folks based on their skills, experiences, and potential, rather than the degrees that they have in their byline. That said, not everyone in the nonprofit sector is quite there yet. And I believe in a lot of bigger, more traditional nonprofits that credentialing is still very, very important. So really my short answer for that is it depends on where you're looking and kind of where you want to work.
Fantastic. Jeff, any last thoughts? 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's the hiring world in general is going through a big crisis around credentials. So I think we're all trying to decide the value of the education and how it fits. Volunteering, I think all of us who've led organizations know that volunteers are great. Be careful of your reason for volunteering, so it's not, be transparent. If you're honest about wanting to work for us and you want to volunteer and learn, be upfront, share with us. Sort of the person who's secretly doing it can be more problematic than ever. We want to help you. We want to build our future staff members. And lastly, I find that this might disagree with somebody well, but I found that in history, people think that they can have this great corporate career and then say, I'm mid-career now and I'm ready to do my passion project. And I do think that it's very different worlds. And I think that people that are in the nonprofit space get a little bit frustrated where someone thinks because I had 25 years of corporate finance, I can come now and run your nonprofit. I'm glad Terry's shaking your head because I find that it's a little bit frustrating and but we want you, but let's figure out how you fit best within the organization because you're going to be incredibly valuable, but may not be ready to lead the organization with one jump over. So that's just my sort of old time response to that kind of transition question that people have.
Fantastic. Wow. All right. So we're going to go into breakout rooms now. So Rebecca has just dropped some of the conversation starters in the chat, but I will also talk through them here. And in each of your breakout rooms will be one of our panelists to kind of help facilitate the conversation. The goal here is threefold. One, introduce yourself. Let us know what you're trying to accomplish in your career. Two, kind of share some of your feelings and experiences around how you effectively have networked in the field or are looking to network. And then three, how did you know you were ready for advancement in the nonprofit sector or switching careers or something like that? These are the guiding kind of tenets and pillars that we'll keep around our breakout room conversations today. I will send us away in just a second, and then we'll come back to the main session at the very end here. The goal will be probably just a few minutes before we close, right before 10 a.m. All right. Rebecca will press the magic button that will send us off into our breakout sessions. So, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
I'm going to pause recording.
Great. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had some phenomenal conversation in your breakout rooms. That is all we have for Coffee and Career Connections today. I want to take a moment and give a virtual round of applause to all of our incredible panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your feedback and all of your deep, deep knowledge and resources of the nonprofit industry. We are very, very grateful for all of you. We will be sending a wrap-up email to everyone who registered for today's event. Included in there will be a recording, not of the breakout rooms, but of the panel discussion that happened beforehand. There will also be some additional information around some of the resources mentioned, including the Maroon and Gold Network. This is my, once again, another plug. What I saw from the chat, what I saw from everyone's introductions, and from all the discussion that we had is that every single one of you have incredible resources and information to share and to connect together with each other and with other alumni and students of the University of Minnesota. So please take a look at Maroon and Gold Network. I see somebody is asking if we can get a copy of the chat. We will make sure that we will get the links from the chat into that post-event email so that everybody has access to things like Pollen that were mentioned. And then there will be a short survey attached to the email that's sent. That helps us make sure that we are providing content that is applicable, helpful, and informative for all of you. And it also helps us be able to offer more career services just like this. So if you take a moment and do that, we would very much appreciate it. If you need any more information about anything we talked about today or information about the Alumni Association in general, you can visit umnalumni.org and enjoy the rest of your sunny, beautiful Tuesday morning. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.